Hello Year 11 and welcome to the third video on how to answer the GCSE questions for OCR History B. This video is in relation to the making of America 1789 to 1900. So for your Making of America paper, you will see that the layout is identical to your public health exam. So there are no sources or interpretations on this module, and therefore everything that you answer will be questions that are just pure knowledge based. So you will have 3 1-mark questions, 1 9-mark question, 1 10-mark question, and then again you will have a choice of 2 18-mark questions, and you will select the one that you think is most preferable to answer. So for the Making of America, you have 5 different time periods, and I really want to stress here that you absolutely have to know the dates for these time periods. So just like with public health, the fact that you need to know that there are 4 time periods and the dates and the centuries for them. For Making of America, you need to know that when you read a question, which section of the course the exam board are looking for you to provide evidence from. So you can see them here clearly, and I would say that this has to be a real central point for your revision. So if you were going to make a mind map, for example, I would put American expansion in the middle and then your evidence on the outside, but you need to know that the dates for that are 1789 to 1838. So I would encourage you to refer back to this slide. You will have this in your exercise books as well from lesson, but keep referring back to these dates because you must make sure that your evidence is applicable if you're going to achieve high marks on this paper. So for your 1-mark questions, Year 11, there will be 3 of them, again exactly the same as public health, and you answer them in exactly the same way as you would on that paper as well. So you answer them with 1 word or 1 phrase. So for example, name 1 US president before 1830, you can just write the name George Washington, and you would then move on to question 1B and question 1C. Again, it is just worth stating here that remember, if you write more than 1 response for this answer, then the examiner can only mark your first answer. So if you'd written George Washington first, you'd be absolutely fine. If you'd written Barack Obama and then written George Washington, you won't get the mark. So please make sure that you are only writing 1 example, or that the first example that you put down you're really confident with, because that is the response that the examiner has to mark. Question will have exactly the same question stem again as the 9-mark question on the public health exam. So it will always say or ask you to write a clear and organised summary of something. In this instance, we have a question that says, write a clear and organised summary that analyses migration to places west of the plains between 1839 and 1860, and then you are asked to support your summary with examples. So the first thing that I would expect you to do in the exam is to highlight key parts of the question. So in this instance, we are analysing again, so we should remember that that means that we are looking at our C's and our S, so our cause, continuity, change, significance, etc. I would then expect you to pick up what the topic is that they are asking you to analyse, which in this instance is migration to places west of the plains. So here, Year 11, we're thinking about the far west, people moving and settling places west of the plains. And then finally, as I said at the start, the dates are really important. So I would expect you to pick up that 1839 to 1860 is our second time period, and that means we are looking for evidence for this question that would come from time period 2, the west. So let's have a look at how we would be expected to answer this question. We would expect to have 2 paragraphs from you. They would be point, evidence and analysis, and that analysis we know comes from our PECS paragraphs, which is cause, consequence, change, continuity, comparison and significance. Remember that you are only expected to use 1 of these per paragraph, and that you can use the same analysis in both paragraphs if you wanted to. So if you wanted to do 2 paragraphs on causes, that would be absolutely fine, obviously provided that the causes were different. That would still ensure that you achieved the marks. So let's have a look at an example of a paragraph together and how the marks are allocated for this response. So in 1839, migration to the far west was limited. So the response here is starting right at the start of this time period that the exam board have given us in the question, and at this point would be on 1 mark. We've made a valid point. We know that migration wasn't particularly far-reaching in 1839. We then need to support some evidence. So the only white people who ventured that far were the mountain men who roamed the Rocky Mountains, trapping beavers for their fur, and this is where we would move up to 3 marks for evidence. At this point, we have no analysis, so therefore you are capped at 3 marks. If you then started to describe something else or extended the description of the evidence that you've already put, you're still going to be capped at 3 marks because the examiner now is looking for this analysis, either your cause, consequence, change, continuity, comparison, or significance. So the last part of this response then states, however, by 1850, over 100,000 people had migrated in wagons on the overland trails to the west coast territories of California and Oregon, hoping to start a new life. By 1860, this had increased to over 400,000. We've then, at this point, got our analysis. We've clearly got an example of change through the statistics of the amount of people that were moving to the west, and at this point the response would be on 6 marks. To enable you then to move up to 9 marks, you would need another paragraph that was structured in exactly the same way. And remember, it could be that you looked at change again. It could be that you looked at one of the other points of analysis that are listed above. So with your 10-mark question, you will always have an explanation question, and this will normally start with something like why did, what was the impact of, what caused, what do you think? So we know that that is how the question will always start, and they are looking for you here to be able to explain your evidence really well. So our question here starts with why were there tensions in America between 1789 and 1838? Again, I would expect you to be looking at what the focus of the question is, which is tension, and to be able to pick out these dates and to know which time period they are speaking to you about, which in this case is time period 1, America's expansion. So the way that we would structure our response to this question is by creating 2 Peel paragraphs. A reminder here that Peel stands for point, evidence, explanation, and then linking back to the question. The examiner will be expecting you to be specific with your evidence, but it's only necessary to include 1 piece per paragraph, and the marks really are coming from this ability to explain the evidence that you give in reference to the question. So let's have a look at an example together. One reason there was tension was because there were different opinions on slavery. So at this point, that is a valid argument, it is a valid point, and we would receive 3 marks. We now need to support this with evidence. Slavery had died out in the North, and Northerners said that slavery gave the South an unfair economic advantage due to the fact that they did not have to pay wages to their workers who laboured picking cotton and tobacco on the plantations. So this is our evidence. We clearly have shown here that we know about slavery, we know what the upset was between the North and the South, and we know that the South were making more money than the North due to the fact that they are employing people to pick cotton and tobacco without having to pay them wages. So we've got that evidence there that is specific, but we haven't yet explained particularly why this caused tension. So we're going to go into explanation now. The South made huge profits as a result of this, which led to tension between North and South over whether or not to allow new states to use slavery. This had to be resolved through laws such as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So we've got clear explanation here. We know that the South are making huge profits. We know that America had to come up with a compromise in 1820 to deal with the tension that was coming from slavery. So at this point we would be on 7 marks out of 10, and our link mark, so our 8th mark, comes from this reinforces that slavery was a huge cause of tension between 1789 and 1838. So that link back to the question is worth that additional mark, and we would be on 8 out of 10 just for 1 paragraph. To achieve 10, you would then be expected to write a paragraph that is structured in exactly the same way, again very specific and very clear, and that would see you achieve 10 marks on this question. Finally, year 11 for this paper, you would then have a choice of 18 mark questions. So you can see here two representative examples of the type of questions that you might get. So the first says, from the 1860s onwards, the railroads were the most important reason for people settling on the plains. How far do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. Or you could select, the growth of big business had a positive impact on the USA and its people between 1877 and 1900. How far do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. So your first task in the exam is going to be to select which question you think is most favourable to you. And to do that, you need to work out what the questions are asking you. Are you being asked to compare a factor given in the question to another factor, or do you need to argue for and against the factor which you have been presented with? So let's break down these questions together. The first question is asking you to explain why the railroads were the most important reason, and then for your opposing paragraphs to explain other factors which led to people settling on the plains during this time period. Again, it's worth us making sure that we know which time period this is focused on, and for us, because this is the 1860s and it's in relation to settling on the plains, we know that this must be time period 4. We also have, for our second question, the growth of big business had a positive impact on the USA and its people between 1877 and 1900. How far do you agree? This question is asking us to explain why big business had a positive impact on the USA, and then your paragraphs that are in contrast to this are explaining why big business had a negative impact. And again, our time period here, 1877 to 1900, you need to know that this is our 5th time period, our last time period. This question historically hasn't been answered very well. Lots of people don't tend to see that big business is this last time period, so it's really, really important that we recognise the dates so that we can make sure that our evidence is applicable to the question. So let's have a look at how we would go about writing a response to this. First of all, you only answer one of the options. Please do not answer both. The examiner will mark both, but you run the risk of irritating them, first of all. And secondly, you will only get the marks for whichever response is higher. So it's obviously much, much better to make sure that you write one response really well. So please make sure that you only select one of these 18 mark questions. You do not need an introduction, so please don't waste your time writing one. You don't get any additional marks for this. You would then structure your response with 4 peel paragraphs. Again, just a reminder of what's been stated on the previous slide, that this stands for point, evidence, explanation, and linking back to the question. Make sure that you are specific with your evidence again, but only including one piece per paragraph and fully explaining it. The marks for this question all come from explanation. So please make sure that yes, you've got some specific evidence, but that you are not spending ages just describing that. It is explanation in reference to the question that is going to get you the marks on this question. Finally, you can receive that 18th mark for producing a judgment, but you must be on 17 marks to qualify for this. It needs to be a clinching argument, and I'll show you an example of one of those in just a moment. But please remember that. Don't rush through to write a judgment, because if your paragraphs prior to that aren't of sufficient quality, you will not be achieving that 18th mark. So let's have a look at an example of a paragraph that would qualify for good marks, for explanation. And I've chosen to write a paragraph that is answering the question, from the 1860s onwards, the railroads were the most important reason for people settling on the plains. How far do you agree? Give reasons for your answer. So if we have a look at this paragraph together, I disagree with the statement due to the Homestead Act having a significant impact. So at this point, we're on 4 marks. We've identified an alternative reason for why people were settling on the plains. It's specific. The examiner would like this, so we have a point and we have 4 marks at this particular moment. We're then going to support that with evidence. We're going to show we know what the Homestead Act actually was. It offered 160 acres of land for a small fee to anyone who was prepared to settle and farm on the plains for at least 5 years. The government wanted the land settled so it would become more productive. At this point, we've got evidence. We're showing the examiner that we know what the Homestead Act is, but because we are only describing, we're not explaining why that led to people settling on the plains. We are at this point at 5 marks. So to turn this into explanation, this was important as it led to hundreds of thousands of Americans, as well as immigrants from Europe, rushing to claim land and a new life on the plains, as they believed that they would be able to have a comfortable life there. So this is explanation, and we're on 7 marks at this point. We know that it must be an important reason because we've clearly outlined to the examiner that we know it wasn't just Americans, it was immigrants as well, and that they are looking at this new life. So clearly here we're saying the Homestead Act and what it was attracted people to the plains rather than the railroads that have been stated in the question. We now need to link back to the question, so we do that simply by using words from it. Therefore, the Homestead Act was more significant than the railroads for people settling on the plains. And at this point, we would receive 9 marks. So in terms of how you then move up the mark scheme, if you were to write a second fully explained Peel paragraph, you would receive between 10 and 12 marks. For 3 fully explained Peel paragraphs, between 13 and 15 marks. And for 4 fully explained Peel paragraphs, it would be between 16 and 17 marks. Now, if you had written a response that was on 17, you had 4 very well explained paragraphs, you could then qualify for the 18th mark by producing a clinching argument or judgment. So I would always encourage you to start your clinching argument or judgment with the word despite. You are showing the examiner that you are going to compare both sides of the argument. This isn't the time to be introducing lots of new evidence to your work. You must be reflective of what you've written, but you need to try and produce this clinching argument. So let's have a look at this together. Despite the fact that government initiatives such as the Homestead Act encouraged people to move to the plains as they believed they could start a new life, ultimately, without the railroad to offer them ease of passage onto the plains rather than the treacherous journey people would have made prior to its creation, this is proof that the railroads were the most important reason for people settling on the plains. So we can clearly see here that we have this clinching argument because we have referenced other reasons why people move there, but ultimately we are saying that the railroad actually enabled people to physically get there, and therefore that makes the railroads the most important or significant reason for people settling on the plains. So at this point, if this was at the end of 4 Peel paragraphs that were very well put together, like the one that you can see at the top of the screen, then you would achieve 18 marks. So that's it for Making of America. I hope that's been helpful in terms of how to answer the questions, and the next video will go through how you answer the questions for living under Nazi rule.